From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We want to start with the markets as we do every day, and Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, just glancing at it, looks like the S&P kind of is coming back today.
Yes, it is. And in fact, the first up day in 5 days. So the bulls are trying to reestablish positioning here. And of course, lots of it has to do with vaccine optimism. We did have the announcement from the FDA today that Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective. They will be ruling on it later this week on Thursday as to whether or not it will receive that emergency authorization that Pfizer's vaccine received last week. It's largely expected this will happen. So if all goes well, that vaccine should be in distribution, relatively soon as well, David. So this means in the longer term, medium term, that the economy will be able to reopen. So on this, we do have the S&P 500 trading higher, the NASDAQ 100 trading higher. Interestingly, though, the NASDAQ 100 is up less than the S&P, up just 0.3%. And the big drag there, David, is Moderna. So this is very similar to what we saw yesterday with Pfizer. Pfizer, their vaccine was actually starting to go into distribution. That stock closed down more than 4%. Moderna down 4.6%. So a little bit of sell the news action there. In addition, we have some of the big tech names down too. Facebook down 2%. So interesting weakness there. However, David, bonds not worried. We have that 10-year yield climbing. So overall, it is a bullish risk-on picture, even as folks, investors, traders are waiting for news on stimulus. But right now, they're pretty happy about the idea that a vaccine and now a second vaccine is potentially close to distribution, David.
So, Abigail, you always look for little counter indicators. Do you see any oil someplace else today?
Today, not so much, David. One that had my eye yesterday, and of course we had that bearish reversal because initially stocks opened higher yesterday and then closed down. The VIX, that quote-unquote fear index, when it's above 20, that tells you that uncertainty does remain elevated. It is still well above 20. That tells you some investors are hedging to some degree, that they still think that the near term could be difficult around this virus situation, even as we come to believe that the medium and long term will be more positive as the vaccine gets into the population. So that keep an eye on that VIX. If that's above 20, that tells you some of the smart, fast money that they are hedging a little bit, that they're not completely bullish in this picture. That's a beneath the surface tell to look at, David.
Okay, thank you so much, Abigail. We really appreciate it. In the meantime, Congress is in a rush to get its work done before it breaks for the holidays. It has an omnibus spending bill. Look like it will be going forward sometime later this week, and it may be attached to some form of stimulus bill as well, with some compromise being talked about. We welcome now John Yarmuth. He is Democratic Congressman from Kentucky and also the chair of the House Budget Committee. So, Congressman, it's great to have you back with us. Thank you for being with us. We just saw an announcement just a few minutes ago that actually Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, is going to be meeting with her counterpart, Mr. McCarthy, as well as the Senate leadership. They're going to have a confab later this afternoon at 4 p.m. Are we moving toward a deal, do you think?
It looks that way, David, and it's great to be back. I just realized that you can't see me smiling, but I'm happy to be back. But this is something that should never have gotten this far. We passed the CARES Act in March. We passed the HEROES Act in May, and Senator McConnell, who's my constituent, as I am his, said at the time, we'll have to wait and see once we pass the CARES Act if we needed more help from the federal government. Of course, that was sensible, but it wasn't sensible not to start working on Plan B. And we all thought this was going to be over in midsummer. Many people did. So we provided for that in the CARES Act. And here it is in December, and we still don't have an ongoing solution to the many, many tragedies that the American people are experiencing right now. And we've seen employment numbers take a turn for the worst in the last week. We know that it looks like December is going to be very soft on the employment level, and we've got potentially a lot of evictions coming up in a couple of weeks if Congress doesn't act. So we put not just, we haven't helped with the strain that Americans are feeling, but we also put a lot of additional stress on them. We should have been more responsible than this.
So my understanding, Congressman, is that basically that group, that bipartisan group from the Senate, divided the issues into two camps. One of them would include things like support for small businesses and some of the unemployment insurance that is going to go away at the end of the year. That seems to be something people agree on, but it separates out the assistance for the states and the liability limitation. Is that a sensible compromise, and what will that do to states and local governments if we don't get that done?
Well, I don't think it's sensible, but again, I don't think it's sensible that we are where we are in general. Right now we're asking the states to be the leaders and the implementers of this incredible challenge to distribute vaccine across the country over the next few months. And states and localities are already hurting desperately for revenue. We've already laid off 2 million public service employees across the country since the pandemic started. We need to provide resources for those states and localities to do what we're asking them to do, which is save the lives of millions of Americans. And it's incredible that this has become political, that Republicans seem to think this is a blue state, red state thing. I remember seeing Governor Asa Hutchinson a few weeks ago begging Congress to act. And Arkansas certainly doesn't even have a tinge of blue in it. My state, we have a Democratic governor, but everything else is Republican, and Trump carried the state easily. We are desperately in need of help. I talked to my mayor just this morning, mayor in Louisville, and who's also president of the National Council of Mayors, and he says cities are hurting all over. They're having trouble actually doing the basic stuff, the block and tackling, the policing, security, healthcare. And now we're asking them to help distribute the vaccine. So we need the help, and it should not be tied to liability reform, which is what the Senate Majority Leader McConnell is pushing to do. Yes, I think there's a valid case to be made for liability reform, but we need to do what needs to be done right now. And I think what Mitch McConnell said was, let's do what we agree on now, and let's do what we don't agree on sometime later. State and localities can't wait till later.
You mentioned the mayor of Louisville, Greg Fischer. As it happens, we're going to be talking to him in just a few minutes from right now on this program, Congressman. At the same time, as you talk about Kentucky and what's going on in Kentucky, I am mindful of the fact that one of the residents of Kentucky, last time I checked, was Mitch McConnell, who was the one who's resisting that. In fact, I hear he may even be a constituent of yours. Explain that. Does Kentucky not have the problem that other states are having right now?
Well, of course it does, and this is what's just so kind of disingenuous about what Mitch and other Republicans have said. Again, we are not a blue state in Kentucky, and we are definitely hurting. Revenues are down. We've laid off a lot of public sector employees over the last 8 months, and we need help just as every other state does. Our cities do, and I can't imagine why the Republicans who try to empower states, that's part of their core set of values, is states' rights and responsibilities, we wouldn't help give them the resources they need to carry out the roles we're asking them to play. Again, states have to balance their budgets. The federal government doesn't have to. And what virtually everybody in a position of knowledge knows, whether it's the chair of the Fed, Jay Powell, whether it's people like Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who the former CBO director, who has been a deficit hawk, they all said we have plenty of fiscal room to make the kind of investment that we need to make right now. So we ought to do it. It looks like Mitch McConnell and a few members of the Senate are the only people who don't think we need to react in a very serious and massive way.
So, Congressman, I certainly can understand you're concerned about those people who will be going off of the supplemental unemployment at the end of the year. The small businesses will be hurt. So we need to get support for them. We may need to leave behind some of the other issues you think, as you said, would be sensible to do. As a practical matter, if you don't get the state assistance, you don't deal with the liability limitation at this point, is it gone as you go into the next term?
Well, you're going to lose a lot of very good public servants along the way. No, I don't think it's gone. I think one thing that I'm optimistic about is even this compromise measure is designed to get us through March. So it kind of speaks out or implies that we're going to have to do something else, and we will have a president and his economic team who I think understand the importance of doing it. We'll have the bully pulpit then. We'll lay out a very compelling case and clear case as to why we have to do take a certain path and how much that's going to cost us. And that's one thing we haven't had is presidential leadership in this national economic challenge and humanitarian challenge. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that regardless of what happens in Georgia and what happens with control of the Senate, with very strong leadership coming out of the next administration, that we have a much better chance of getting something done.
Okay, Congressman, it's always a great pleasure to have you with us. That is Congressman John Yarmuth, Democrat of Kentucky. And as I mentioned to him, we're going to be talking with his hometown mayor, Mayor of Louisville, Greg Fischer, a little later on in this program, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Christine Todd Whitman served as the 50th governor of the state of New Jersey before she went on to head the EPA. She's also been very involved with an advisory panel, really taking a look at the elections to make sure that they were done properly and that every vote counted. A bipartisan group, I must say. And we welcome now former Governor Christine Todd Whitman. Thank you so much, Governor, for being with us. Tell us about this group, because frankly, I was not that familiar with it before.
Well, VPP is made up, Voter Protection Program it was called, and it is bipartisan, nonpartisan, apartisan, whatever you want to call it, because it's made up of attorneys generals, members of law enforcement, a few people like me thrown in, but people who really care about the law and the rule of law and wanted to make sure that this election was as clean and fair and free as any that we have had. And once we saw what was going on, I mean, we were monitoring all the way through, monitoring particularly in those swing states, watching to see that things were being done right. It wasn't a question of whether Biden won a state or Trump won a state. It was whether it was done legitimately. And then once all the questions started to arise, these people, and really it wasn't me, because the lawyers in the group are the ones who are doing an incredible job of writing the amicus briefs and filing briefs to counteract some of these just ridiculous claims that were being made, and messaging, trying to reach those people in those states to say, look, this has been okay. It's been right. Everybody's been watching. There wasn't fraud here. There's been no proof that's been given to the people. There's no there. And so we've been trying to get that message out to people, because it's as important, not just for this election as it will be for the next, and people's confidence in our election process.
It seems to me that that's one of the big questions coming out of this election, which is, what is the reputation of democracy, of our democracy in this country? We heard President-elect Biden last night as he gave those remarks. He spent a fair amount of his time, actually, defending the process itself, not just the numbers that came in, but all of the people, Republican and Democrats, who were officials at the state and local level, what they did, as well as the court system, going up to the Supreme Court, but including state and federal courts. As you look at this entire thing, because you've had a hard look at it, how did we do? What is the reputation of democracy after this election?
Well, actually, we did very well. I mean, in a time of a pandemic with a president who had been setting up the idea that there were going to be a stolen election, that there would be fraud, because he's been talking about this for a year now, about the only way he could lose is if it were stolen from him. To have come through it the way we have, and yes, there have been challenges. Yes, they're still going on, and they will go on, because it's not so much about this election now, I think, is about the next one. But I think we should show this is the strength of it. It's been tried. Our democracy was tried in this election cycle as it has never been tried before, or at least not in anybody's living lifetime. And we've come through it. We showed that the rule of law works. We've showed that those men and women, Republican, Democrat, because it's both sides, who stood up, stood for the rule of law, who did their duty, those women, men and women, many of them retirees who stood up counting the votes, and in Georgia for 3 different times overseeing this process. We should be thankful that ordinary citizens have taken this so seriously. And the vote turnout is another example of people finally taking this franchise meaningfully and understanding its importance. I think we should say it's good, but we've also shown the weaknesses. There are things that we need to work on. Obviously, we need to take some steps to ensure that the people have confidence in the system. That's the biggest loss, I think, that we've had from this election. If you can say that it's a loss for our democracy, is that this constant repeating of false claims to undermine the credibility of the vote and the people that are buying into it. That's where we have to be concerned. We have to remind people, we came through this, we did it well, we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power. That's the way we've always done it in this country, and we will continue to do it. That's where the majority of the American people want to be.
Governor Whitman, finally, let me turn to another area of your expertise. As I said, you ran the EPA under George W. Bush, President George W. Bush. We right now have a president-elect coming in with a very aggressive, very assertive program when it comes to climate. Give us your thoughts on what he should be looking for as an EPA administrator. Mindful of the fact the person that had been talked about it, she is a regulator from the state of California, is running into some controversy because of the lack of environmental justice. How important is environmental justice?
Oh, I mean, again, if this election has shown anything, it's shown the divide in this country between people who have access to voting, but also people who have been discriminated against over the history of our country. And environmental justice is an enormous issue. It's a very important issue. It means that what we're recognizing is there are communities, because they lacked the economic power or the political power to fight back, have been sites for some of the worst polluting plants. And it is showing itself in this pandemic because you have people living in those areas that have higher incidence of asthma. Their health isn't as good because they've been subject to so much of the pollution over time. So that's going to be a big part of it. But really, I think the number one challenge is, as with so many things, is to restore people's confidence. And in this instance, it would be science, both for environmental issues and for health. I mean, look at what's happened with the pandemic by ignoring science so early on and so consistently for such a long period. It's something that is going to prove to be a big challenge for whomever comes in. They have to try to restore the morale at the agency, which has been severely battered. A lot of what's happened is they've lost a lot of the institutional knowledge. Some 900 scientists have left the agency. They've been replaced to the extent of about 350, right. But many of those came from the institutions that are the very companies that are overseen by the agency. So there's a lot of work to do there, but bringing back the credibility and people's confidence in the science and the importance of science is going to be a key factor.
Governor, thank you so very much. Always a pleasure to have you with us. That's former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman. And now we're going to turn from the United States over to Europe, where the EU is announcing major new regulation, proposing it for the tech industry. We turn to our colleague Maria Tadeo, who is with Margrethe Vestager. She is Executive Vice President of the European Commission.
That's right, David, thank you so much. Two big pieces of legislation just announced in the European Union that could have big repercussions for American tech. And on that note, I'm happy to say we are joined by the European Commissioner, Margrethe Vestager. Today, you've announced a whole bunch of measures. We could see big fines of up to 10%. We could see potential breakup of companies, disinvestment. And you also say that companies need to take a responsibility. The digital market is the same as brick and mortar. So I wonder, do you worry about the reaction from companies like Facebook, Amazon, and so on?
Well, what we worry about is competition and a fair marketplace. And we have been consulting extensively. We've been talking with, everyone. We've had experts, member states, parliaments, businesses, organizations. What they worry about is being able to do fair business. And what they worry about is too much illegal content, both product and services. So this is our worry. And of course, we are balancing things, which is why we think that this is, well, quite a proportionate proposal.
And when you were explaining some of the measures, you said that this is not targeting anyone in particular and that you hope you don't have to fine anyone, but nonetheless you could see 10% fine over your revenue here. Is that something that you're looking to do as a measure if needed, however?
Well, I think that anyone would want to comply with legislation that has been passed by our legislature here, the Parliament, the Council. Why wouldn't you want to do that? But it's also good to have an incentive. And the incentive of a fine of 10% of your turnover, I think that's a good incentive.
And could we read that perhaps as a warning too?
Well, the strange thing is that in my work as competition law enforcer, I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of practices that has been really damaging for other businesses. Now we say sort of in general, well, these are the things that you must do. These are the things that you should not do. And I think it will bring a better balance into the marketplace. And that is what we need. Because this is actually a bit more than just competition law enforcement and making that general. this is also beyond addressing unfair trading practices. And we have seen that no matter how vigilant we are in competition law enforcement, we need to work hand in hand with regulation in order to have an open and contestable market.
And one of the things you said is that in terms of the gatekeepers or companies that may have too big a position in the market, if that was needed, you could look into potentially breaking up or asking a company to disinvest and split up their business. That is something that investors really worry about and look at that as almost a nuclear option. Is that the nuclear option for you, or are you willing to use that too if needed?
Well, I think that we will have compliance because I think it's proportional, it's reasonable. It's actually what you would expect if you're an investor, that the business that you invest in actually is by the book. If they're not, then it is fines, another fines, repeated fines, behavioral commitments. But there is the option eventually to ask for a divestiture, splitting up a company. I would not expect that we should go there, but as a last resort, I find that it is justifiable.
Okay, so it's justifiable, but it's not something that you're looking to do anytime soon, to that respect?
No, of course not. What we want is an open, contestable marketplace where businesses can find their customers. This is what we want to achieve.
You also say moving away from competition, that internet that really controls some of the information that goes on, and especially the fake news and really some stuff that is clearly not factual and could confuse the public is equally important for the Europeans. I wonder specifically with Facebook, we've seen a lot of fake news when it comes to COVID, the vaccine and so on. What are they telling you in terms of A, how quickly they're going to take it down, and are they going to be held liable at one point for that content?
Well, actually, I think that we have had quite a good cooperation with a number of the platforms to make sure that when people are looking for information about COVID and the pandemic and vaccines, that they get sort of official vetted information. So this will not regulate content. But if a member state, for instance, say, well, this is illegal, well, then if you are flagged, this is illegal, you have to take it down. But the other thing is they also have to tell the people who were behind it, we have taken down your content. Do you want to complain about it? Because just as well as it's important for us that what is illegal offline is also taken down as illegal online, freedom of expression is obviously also key.
And the other company, especially heading into Christmas, that has been very much in focus is Amazon. We've seen a lot of small companies in Europe push back. They say it's unfair. They're not able to compete with a huge company like Amazon, and especially in the time of COVID. I wonder, do you sympathize with them? Do you feel that hurt from the small companies in Europe?
Yes, I do. And you know, we just sent a statement of objection to Amazon because what we conclude, preliminary, yes, but what we conclude so far is that they use the data from all these small traders and use that to sort of assess what they themselves as a retailer should put on the market, which of course makes their risks very, very small compared to the small guy who have to, you know, take a risk and guess what is the next thing that someone wants to buy.
Well, Commissioner, thank you so much. Always good to see you on Bloomberg. And that was the European Commissioner, Margrethe Vestager. David, you know, two big pieces of legislation announced today in Europe that could make a huge difference. But I would say this is not happening overnight. Usually this could take up to 2 years.
No, and by the way, it's been a long time coming, Maria, as you know so well. There's been, particularly Margrethe Vestager has been very aggressive in trying to regulate tech over in Europe. I must say we all have something similar to that going on back here in the United States as well, as we've got these FTC action against Google and Facebook, and the Justice Department against Google and the FTC against Facebook. So there's a lot going on tech regulation on both sides of the Atlantic. Maria, thank you so very much for that terrific interview, very timely interview. We'll have to be watching that as it develops because it could have real ramifications for some of the big tech companies who happen to be based in the United States, which itself is sometimes an issue because there's a perception that perhaps this is almost anti-American, as the Europeans are particularly tough on regulating tech, including with taxation and things like that. In the meantime, we're going to be coming back to the United States and taking a hard look at the Federal Reserve meetings, which are starting today, and how they're going to have to take into account what's going on with the COVID crisis here. How do they take into account what's happening with the economy when we don't know exactly what's happening with that, and the vaccine appears to be around the corner? And we will talk with the Louisville mayor. He is the president of the U.S. Council of Mayors, and he is Mr. Greg Fischer, about what is happening in his state and his city and how mayors across the country are dealing with COVID. That's on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Hundreds of hospitals in the United States are gearing up to vaccinate their workers against COVID-19. Packed in dry ice to stay at ultra-frozen temperatures, shipments of Pfizer's vaccine began arriving at 400 additional hospitals and distribution sites a day after the nation's death toll surpassed 300,000. The first 3 million shots are being earmarked for frontline health workers and elder care patients. Federal regulators today issued a positive review of a second coronavirus vaccine. My colleague David Weston will have more on that coming up. The nation's top infectious disease expert expects to be vaccinated against COVID-19 as early as this week. It's not just because Dr. Anthony Fauci is still seeing patients. He tells the Washington Post he believes getting inoculated on camera could help boost Americans' confidence that the vaccine is safe to take. Dr. Fauci says between 75% to 85% of the U.S. population must be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. For the first time, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is acknowledging that Joe Biden won the presidential election. He spoke on the Senate floor this morning.
As of this morning, our country has officially a president-elect and a vice president-elect. So today I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden. The president-elect is no stranger to the Senate. He's devoted himself to public service for many years.
Leader McConnell also praised President Trump, saying it's hard to list all the president's, quote, major wins. McConnell refused to acknowledge Biden's win until now, saying President Trump was entitled to pursue his claims in court. The transition to a Biden White House is continuing despite President Trump's refusal to concede. Multiple sources say Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will meet this week with his designated successor, Antony Blinken. It could be the first face-to-face cabinet-level transition contact between the outgoing and incoming administrations. Secretary Pompeo has been one of President Trump's strongest defenders. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. The Federal Reserve is beginning its first of 2 days of meetings today, and one of the big questions it's facing is what to make of an economy that is being racked by the coronavirus. At the same time, vaccines are now being distributed across the country. To give us a sense of how the disease and the vaccines are making through, we now welcome Drew Armstrong, who heads our healthcare coverage right here at Bloomberg. So, Drew, thanks so much. I guess the big news today, besides continued vaccinations, is some news on Moderna, because we have an FDA staff report sort of giving it a clean bill of health, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this staff report that FDA produces typically ahead of any decision on a drug or vaccine looks to be very, very good news, similar to Pfizer in that respect when the emergency use authorization for Pfizer was being considered. And saying that, you know, it looks like this is 94.1% effective. You don't have a particularly worrisome side effect profile. I think this is certainly an indication that this will get authorized for use under these emergency measures, perhaps as soon as the end of this week after outside advisors to the FDA meet and discuss this.
Fascinating. And thus far, what do we have a sense of how fast that vaccine is going out right now? We have the inoculations being done. There's a lot of predictions about where we'll be in the first quarter and things. What should we realistically expect?
You know, what the government has said is that we'll see approximately, I believe, 20 million people vaccinated by, you know, the end of this year. At least, getting their first shot of these two-dose shots. And, you know, that obviously compared to, 330-some million people in the United States is not that many. We are still waiting to see really kind of the mass availability that is going to come later this year. We are actually keeping track of all this data. We're beginning to see the initial reports from states trickle out about early vaccinations and hope to begin posting some of that information soon. But I think right now at this point, this is going to be a slow trickle to healthcare workers, other particularly vulnerable frontline folks, or people in nursing homes that will begin to get inoculated in the coming days and weeks.
So, Drew, I'm not a public health person. Sadly, I don't think the Federal Reserve is either. But that says to me that there's help coming, but it's not right around the corner, that in terms of the economy, it's going to be a while before we see a material effect on this disease.
Yeah, I think that that's right. We are still in a period in this pandemic that, despite the wonderful news, and I cannot emphasize how wonderful it is that there is a vaccine, that we're at perhaps the most dangerous part of this outbreak in the entire year. Deaths are hitting records pretty consistently. New cases are hitting records almost every day. I mean, this is as bad and as widespread geographically as the outbreak has been in the United States since this began. And public health officials have been emphasizing that people do need to still continue taking those protective measures like social distancing, mask wearing, not assuming that just because there is a vaccine out there that things are over. A vaccine does not do anybody any good as long as it is sitting on a shelf somewhere and not going into the arms of lots of people.
Okay, Drew, thank you so very much. That's Drew Armstrong, who heads our healthcare coverage here at Bloomberg. So what does the Fed make of all this? We turn to our resident expert. He is Michael McKee, and he is our international economics and policy correspondent. Mike, so what does the Fed do? They have to have some projections, I assume, of what the economy is going to do over the next 6, 12 months. How does it make that projection?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm sure it's one that'll get posed to Jay Powell because they are supposed to release new economic forecasts at this meeting. But how do you make a forecast if you don't know, A, the course of the virus, and B, whether or not there will be any kind of economic fiscal stimulus? So the Fed is in a tough position. There's three things people think they could do. One is tie their rate increases to numerical targets for unemployment and prices. That way it suggests to the markets this will be lower for longer. Two is increase QE, buy more stuff. But right now the Atlanta Fed GDP Now tracker is at 11%. So things have slowed. The Fed thinks they're going to get worse, but the economy is not in that bad a shape. Finally, they could buy more at the longer end. You look at the 10-year note yield, and it is struggling to get above 1%. It almost got there this week, but now headed back down again. So do they need to do anything to try to push down on long-term rates? Those are the questions they're going to have to answer.
This is the first meeting that they're having since Steven Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury, asked for his money back, so to speak, on those 13.3, the so-called 13.3 facilities. Do we expect to hear anything on that, about the need maybe to re-up them with the new administration coming up?
That's going to be a very interesting question to put to Jay Powell, because does he want to say anything that would upset the current administration? He's got to live with them for another 6 weeks, and if things are really going badly, he might need their help. And there is money in the Exchange Stabilization Fund that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin could contribute. But on the other hand, is this a good opportunity for him to say, we need help and we need to make sure that we have it in place, ready to go if the economy turns down? Be a tightrope walk for him.
Well, talking about a tightrope, right now this week, I think Congress is finally going to have to decide one way or the other on the fiscal stimulus. In the past, Jay Powell has been reasonably explicit, I think it's fair to say, in saying we need more fiscal stimulus. Is he going to step into that, given the real pressure being put on that issue just today?
Probably not explicitly. He may say, yes, we need more fiscal help or the economy needs additional help, but he's tried very hard not to give advice to members of Congress who don't really like to get it on what they should be doing. But you can expect him to make the point that the Fed can't do it by itself. And getting back to your original question, all the things the Fed could do tomorrow are to push down on interest rates, but they're at record lows and mortgage rates are at record lows. So there isn't much the Fed can do to help the economy at this point, particularly with those lending programs going away.
Okay, Michael, it's always such a great treat to have you with us. That's Michael McKee. He's our international economics and policy correspondent. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Greg Fischer. He is both the mayor of Louisville and the president of the U.S. Mayor's Conference about what his city and what cities across the country need in the wake of this pandemic. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Cities all across the country have been hit really hard by the pandemic. Both their healthcare systems have had a lot of pressure put on them. At the same time, their businesses and their economies are really racked. We welcome now the mayor of Louisville, Greg Fischer, who knows the situation firsthand. He also is the president of the U.S. Council of Mayors, so he speaks for a lot of cities across the country. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with what's really timely in Washington, at least right now, which is this proposed stimulus compromise, something that may go forward finally this week, although apparently at the cost of having assistance for state and local government. How badly does your city, cities across the country, need this help from the federal government?
Hey, David, good to be with you. No, this is a dire time, not just for individuals and small businesses, but state and local governments as well, because the pandemic obviously has racked the economy. The tax receipts are down, so that's the fuel that comes into local government. And when you put a personal face on it, think about the police officers that you depend upon, the emergency medical workers that you depend on, firefighters. That's what we're talking about, not having enough money to pay those salaries, so you're going to have to downsize local government to have fewer services at a time when people need them more than ever. So what we're seeing in D.C. right now, obviously, is we got two separate bills up there. One that's got a bunch of good stuff in it that I'm excited about for our small businesses, for extending the eviction moratorium out 30 days. It needs to go out a lot further than that. We're going to have an eviction crisis here on December the 3rd. If Congress doesn't act on that, potentially tens of millions of households without a place to stay. So that needs to be extended past January 31st. Unemployment insurance is in the big bill, so that's good. And then ability to make sure the vaccine gets out. The other bill, the smaller bill, it's $160 billion, I believe, with about 40% going to local government, 60% to state. That's the bill that's going to stabilize local government services, which is all the stuff people take for granted, garbage pickup and firefighting, the things I just mentioned before. And the rub there is they're trying to get some liability protection on one hand from the Republicans. Democrats are arguing back and forth on that. And what's being held at bay is this local and state government assistance, which could have a devastating impact on local government. So we really need Congress to figure that out here in the next couple of days.
Well, leading the vanguard on the resistance to the state and local assistance, as well as the limitation on liability, has been Mitch McConnell. Last time I checked, he is a resident of Kentucky. What doesn't he get? Because if you talk to Mitch McConnell, he says, look, at that money for state government is really just going to go for some states, typically talks about California and New York, that have just been profligate, have spent too much. And in fact, we don't need it in states that are more reasonable, maybe like Kentucky.
Well, the data doesn't bear that out. Every state, whether they're red states or blue states, has been really hurt by the pandemic. So I know that was an early talking point. It's been moved way past that. I think the leader understands that there needs help at the state and local government. He wants to see some type of liability protections and reasonable liability protections. I certainly understand that as well. And that's the challenge facing Congress right now, to figure that out. And I hope what they don't do is when they pass this larger bill that they declare victory and go home, and they leave all the states and local governments in a position where we cannot continue basic services, life-saving services that people depend on. And what we learned in the Great Recession was, by not investing in the local and state governments, it extended the period of our recovery by a year or two. So we don't need to make that same mistake again. Now is a vital time to think about public safety, emergency services. We do not want to jeopardize those services for the benefit of the people in the cities of America.
Mr. Mayor, please give us a sense of what's going on in Louisville and other cities as well, insofar as you know, with respect to the pandemic right now, the infection from the disease, and also the vaccination program, which has now started as of yesterday.
Which is super exciting. And we're proud here in Louisville. We're the home of UPS's Worldport. So the distribution of the vaccine is going to be happening out of our city toward the eastern United States. The first people, healthcare professionals, started getting inoculated yesterday. So, and finally, David, after what's it been, nine months of torture, there's a little light at the end of the tunnel. But in Louisville, like everywhere in the country right now, infections are continuing to increase. We're kind of stable at a higher plateau. We do have adequate healthcare capacity here, but we're just getting people, we just need to get people to hold on in this multi-month period between when we have the vaccine and when infections are still out there. This coronavirus is not taking a break. It's not taking a Christmas holiday, and it sees that as a real opportunity to spread. So we just keep sending the basic messages, right? Masking, distancing, the drill on that, so we can get through to the vaccine. But mayors are going to be in charge of what I call the last inch. And the last inch is that inch between the needle and your arm to make sure that we're getting the right people in the right place, in the right priority to get vaccinated, and that's being done with the right messengers at the right time as well to build trust in the vaccine so people will go out and say, I want to get this as soon as I possibly can. So it's that nitty-gritty local distribution issues that mayors will be working with their health departments, with the state on to make sure that everybody gets vaccinated in the proper way as soon as possible so we can get to herd immunity, get our economies back open. It's just been, it's been a killer to see what's happened to some of our restaurants and small businesses here that people have invested their dreams in, and they're just gone. So that's another reason why we need this fiscal stimulus ASAP.
It's a terrible situation for so many people, businesses and individuals. And one of the things we've seen through this pandemic is it hits some people disproportionately, particularly the less fortunate, particularly the minorities across the country. What can we do coming out of this to address some of the racial and economic injustices that have really been brought to the forefront by this experience?
Well, that's right. And if we don't do that, we will not be as great a country as we can be. Diversity, in my view, is our secret sauce compared to our foreign competition. So we've got to make sure the vaccine comes out in an equitable manner. We've done that with the testing for the vaccine as well. We've put disproportionate amount of testing sites in low-income communities of color because the infection rates are higher. And throughout the country, mortality is higher in those categories as well. So the vaccine needs to be equitably distributed as well. So after we get through the healthcare workers and the long-term care facilities and first responders, and we should need to go into a category of age inequity. So in Kentucky, for instance, 91% of our deaths come from long-term care facilities and people over age 65. And then our Black and brown communities, as I said, are disproportionately affected. So you can address that with a strategy. Now, like some good news coming out of this is the emphasis that we're putting in our lower invested communities on workforce development with the public partnerships. For instance, our Future of Work initiative with Microsoft, partnered with Humana, a great local company, where we are intentionally reskilling and upskilling folks so they can go from low wage jobs to career jobs in technology. So while all this is going on and people are teleworking, we're repositioning our citizens so they can participate more in the digital economy.
Mayor, that's a terribly important subject, a bigger subject. I hope you'll come back and really have a whole segment to talk about just that. In the meantime, thank you so much to Mayor Greg Fischer of Louisville. Meantime, coming up here, we're going to talk about the relationship between Hong Kong and the mainland, and that is with the outgoing CEO of Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing. He's Charles Lee. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Charles Lee is leaving his position as CEO of Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing after 10 years, and our colleague Sophie Cameroon sat down with him for his closing thoughts.
The Chinese market will never be like the international market in its entirety. The international market will never be able to suit into a Chinese market, but there will be enough, middle ground where they do intersect. It is in that intersection that Hong Kong have to find the most relevant role to play. Because Shanghai will play in that role, Singapore will play in that role, other people will play in that role, but Hong Kong is the only one who can truly go in between and need to find a way, because that role initially is small, becoming bigger and bigger, and then eventually stabilize so that the American will still be here, the Chinese will be here, there will be something in the middle. Then when that middle size is no longer growing, then Hong Kong just need to go deeper.
Now, there was momentum towards embracing Chinese assets. We've seen index compilers, for example, including those equities on their indices. That has stalled somewhat given the U.S. sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. What are the implications of that on China's attempts to integrate into the global markets and its liberalization on the mainland, as well as Hong Kong's role in this?
If you look at that global map, invariably you will walk away with the conclusion that China is the place where yield is going to be, because fundamental economic development is stronger there. The consumer class is growing there. The people are getting more wealthy. The currency is becoming stronger, and their supply chain is as resilient, as strong as ever. While this decoupling will continue to put stress on the respective economies of each other, I think relatively speaking, the Chinese market will become increasingly more important for global investors. So, yeah, government, policy makers, individual political figures can always do whatever they wanted to do that could potentially create short-term temporary impact on a more localized target. But as I said, finance money is like a water. You can't block water. You can block water from one area. You can't block water all the time. Water is going to sip through it. If you block it, it's going to sip through it. It's going to go up to the sky, and then it's going to rain into the other side. They will find a way to get there. You can't really block it. It's not very easy to push water uphill.
And what are your thoughts on banks complying with U.S. sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials?
Well, I think banks are global businesses. A lot of the government have developed very intrusive, sometimes arguably quite arbitrary tactics when they want to achieve certain policy or political or regulatory goals. So the banks have no choice, and they need to be overly compliant. And sometimes that bring unnecessary and also unfair and unjust consequences to their customers. But as I said before, our societies, our politics today, nothing is free. Every action has cost. It's just sometimes, unfortunately, if you happen to be the one who have to incur the cost, what can you do?
Charles Lee, outgoing CEO of Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing, joining us for our second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg.